George Carlin's old house carried the same kind of presence he once did. Sharp, unforgettable, and layered with both humor and heaviness. It stood quietly in the Los Angeles hills, hidden behind tall hedges and iron gates. After Carlin's death, the property sat unsold for a while, almost as if the land itself resisted the idea of new people stepping in. The new owners were a middle-aged couple named Daniel and Rebecca. They weren't celebrity collectors or fans of Carlin in particular. They had been searching for a house with history, something different from the endless line of modern, sterile builds that surrounded Hollywood. The realtor pitched it as a rare piece of cultural heritage, and while they hesitated at first, the price surprisingly lower than expected convinced them to buy. From the beginning, though, the house didn't settle for them. Daniel described it as if the walls had a memory. The study where Carlin used to write had an odd echo. Even after being repainted, it carried the faint smell of old cigarettes and coffee, and at night, the sound of a chair scraping across hardwood sometimes broke the silence, though the chair in that room never moved. Rebecca noticed subtler things, lights that flickered only in the hallway leading to the living room, or the sense of being interrupted when she read aloud in the den, as if the air itself sighed in disapproval. Neighbors warned them in passing, often with a smile, "You'll probably hear George cracking jokes now and then. Don't take it too seriously." First, Daniel laughed this off. But when the couple began waking to find the television on, always tuned to old stand-up specials, the humor wore thin. One night, Rebecca swore she heard a man's voice muttering in the kitchen. Not clear, not angry, more like a dry observation, the kind Carlin was known for, but still unmistakably human. What unsettled them most was how personal it all felt. They didn't feel as though they were intruding on a hostile spirit, but rather as though Carlin himself hadn't finished speaking, and the house had become his microphone. Every creak, every hum of electricity, every unexplained sound seemed to carry a rhythm, almost like a setup waiting for a punchline that never came. The longer they stayed, the more Rebecca insisted they weren't alone. Daniel resisted at first, but after the night he heard laughter, low, unmistakably human. Coming from the empty living room, he stopped denying it. They began keeping the lights on late into the night, unsure whether it comforted them or only made the shadows sharper. Daniel started to notice how the house seemed to breathe differently depending on the time of day. In the mornings, sunlight pushed its way through the wide living room windows, scattering across the floor in golden streaks. For a while, the place looked ordinary, quiet, even peaceful. But as soon as the sun began to drop, the walls seemed to take on weight, and the air inside grew thicker, as though the house itself remembered that it was meant to carry something more than silence. Rebecca, who had always been more sensitive to atmosphere, began avoiding certain rooms altogether. The study, in particular, unnerved her. She tried to make it into her own workspace, decorating with fresh flowers and framed photographs, but every attempt felt rejected. The flowers wilted quickly, the room never seemed to keep warmth, and whenever she sat at the desk, her pen felt heavier, her thoughts slower, as if the space itself resisted her presence. She once confessed to Daniel that she could almost hear words forming just beyond the edge of hearing, phrases she couldn't catch, muttered like commentary from a corner she refused to turn her head toward. At night, their sleep became a fragile thing. Daniel was jolted awake more than once by the sound of a microphone dropping, sharp, metallic, impossible to mistake, though the house contained nothing resembling audio equipment. Other times, Rebecca would wake him with a trembling hand, whispering that someone was in the hallway. When he rose to check, the corridor would be empty, though the faintest smell of tobacco lingered in the air. The neighbors, who had hinted at the house's peculiar nature before, began sharing their own stories in fragments. One elderly man down the street recalled walking his dog late at night and hearing laughter drifting down from the balcony, long after the house had supposedly gone dark. Another neighbor, a woman who had lived there since the 70s, told Rebecca over coffee that she remembered Carlin pacing outside at night, talking to himself as if rehearsing lines. "It's like he never really stopped," she said, her eyes steady, as though she didn't mean it as a joke. The couple grew quieter around each other. They didn't want to admit that they were unsettled, but the signs grew harder to ignore. The television turning on by itself had become almost routine, always to comedy channels, or sometimes late-night talk shows from decades past. Doors they were sure they had closed would stand ajar in the morning. Objects shifted just enough to make them doubt themselves. A pen resting at a new angle, a coaster left on the wrong side of the table. The most unnerving moment came one evening when Rebecca was sitting alone in the living room. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator, when suddenly, the lamp beside her flickered once, then steadied. In the same instant, the silence broke with a low, unmistakable chuckle, a man's laugh, deep and amused, echoing from the corner of the room. Her whole body froze, her breath caught in her throat, and though she wanted to scream for Daniel, she couldn't force the sound out. She sat there trembling, staring at the corner until the light steadied and the laugh dissolved into nothing. When she finally told Daniel, his face paled. He didn't doubt her because he had heard the same laugh, days before, in the kitchen. He hadn't wanted to tell her. The house no longer felt like a shelter. It felt like an audience listening, waiting, amused by their discomfort. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The house began to dictate the rhythm of their days, though neither Daniel nor Rebecca admitted it out loud. They tried, at first, to brush off the strangeness as imagination, the quirks of an old property with too much history. But the house refused to be reduced to coincidence. It insisted on being noticed. Daniel started lingering outside after work, sitting in the car with the engine off just to delay stepping through the gate. He would look up at the balcony and see the curtains sway though the windows were closed. Sometimes the faint outline of a figure never clear, never solid would appear behind the glass. By the time he forced himself to enter, the outline was gone, leaving only the silence of a house that seemed to know it had been caught. Rebecca, meanwhile, grew quieter. She avoided the study entirely, leaving the door closed no matter how much dust gathered inside. Instead, she drifted from room to room with a kind of restlessness that unnerved Daniel. She kept a radio playing softly in the background, as if she were afraid of silence. When Daniel asked her why, she admitted that the quiet in the house didn't feel empty. It felt crowded, layered with sounds just beneath hearing, as though the house hummed with the weight of words too faint to grasp. The nights were the worst. The house never settled into rest. The wooden floors creaked under the weight of footsteps that weren't theirs. The old plumbing knocked and groaned as if in protest, even when no taps were open. The couple began waking at the same time around 3 in the morning, every night eyes snapping open to the same sound. A man's voice, low, conversational, as though he were warming up before a performance. One night, Daniel rose to confront it. He padded down the hall toward the living room, every hair on his arm stiff with unease. The voice faded before he reached the bottom of the stairs, leaving him alone with the muted glow of the streetlight filtering through the blinds. And yet, on the coffee table sat a notebook that hadn't been there the night before. Its cover was blank, unmarked. Inside, the first page was covered in uneven scribbles, as if someone had tried to write while laughing. He didn't show it to Rebecca. He burned it in the backyard the next day, but even as the pages curled to ash, he couldn't shake the sense that the act was being observed, silently critiqued. The neighbors noticed changes in them. At first they laughed it off, jokes about sleepless nights, about inheriting Carlin's ghost as a roommate. But over time, Rebecca's pale face and Daniel's tense jawline made them stop joking. The couple declined invitations, avoided casual conversations at the mailbox, and when spoken to, they replied too quickly, eager to escape. The house was consuming them in ways no one outside could see. Rebecca grew obsessed with the lights. She claimed they flickered not at random, but in rhythm like a coded signal. She began keeping notes, writing down the sequence of blinks, convinced it was a message. Daniel dismissed it until he walked in one night to find her sitting on the floor in front of the hallway lamp, whispering numbers to herself as the bulb pulsed faintly overhead. She looked at him with wide, unblinking eyes and said, "He's still working on his set." The phrase chilled him more than the laugh, more than the moving objects, more than the lingering smell of smoke. It suggested intent, a presence not content to remain in memory, but still rehearsing, still refining, still speaking even through them. And yet they stayed. The thought of leaving had surfaced more than once, but each time they discussed it, something stopped them. Maybe it was the strange pull of living in a house where history felt so alive, or maybe it was something subtler, something whispering in the back of their minds, telling them the story wasn't finished, that to leave now would be to interrupt it mid-sentence. The house didn't want them to leave. The longer Daniel and Rebecca stayed, the more the house seemed to mold itself around them, as though it were studying their habits and adjusting its performance to keep their attention. Days stretched uneasily into weeks. Neither of them could recall the last time they had a night of uninterrupted sleep, nor the last time they felt at ease within their own walls. Daniel began to notice patterns in the way the disturbances unfolded. The footsteps on the stairs came only after they had both gone to bed, never while they were still awake. The flickering lights always occurred when one of them was alone in a room, never together. The television, when it turned itself on, always chose shows with monologues, old clips, sometimes reruns from the 80s, sometimes channels buried so deep in late-night scheduling that neither of them could figure out how they had been accessed. It was as if the house itself knew how to keep them doubting each other's accounts, keeping them isolated in their fear. Rebecca grew thinner. She stopped eating full meals, claiming that the kitchen made her uneasy. The space was too alive, she said. The clinking of glass in the cupboards, the faint hum of the refrigerator, none of it seemed mechanical anymore, but intentional, timed. Once, while reaching for a glass, she swore she felt a hand brush against hers. She dropped the glass, which shattered across the tile, and spent the rest of the night sitting on the edge of their bed, staring at her hands as though they belonged to someone else. Daniel tried to remain pragmatic, but even his patience was wearing thin. He started sleeping in short bursts on the couch, trying to keep watch, but each time he drifted into half-consciousness, the house would rouse him with some small disturbance. The thud of a drawer closing upstairs, the faint scrape of something being dragged across the floor, the whisper of a laugh dissolving into silence. More than once he found himself standing at the bottom of the staircase without remembering having walked there, his chest tight, his palms damp, staring upward as though waiting for something to descend. The study, sealed off by Rebecca, became the heart of his unease. The door swelled slightly in its frame, making it difficult to open. On nights when the house was at its most restless, he would swear he heard the sound of a pen scratching paper inside. It was always faint, always steady, and it never faltered when he placed his ear against the wood. But when he tried the doorknob, it resisted him as though locked from the inside, even though he'd removed the old key months ago. The neighbors, once friendly, had started to keep their distance. The couple who lived across the street no longer waved when Daniel left for work in the morning, and the elderly man with the dog crossed to the other side of the street when passing their driveway. It was as if the house itself radiated a warning that others could sense, a quiet message not to get too close. Rebecca's journals became another source of tension. She filled notebook after notebook with symbols, patterns, and fragments of phrases she claimed were coming from the house. Sometimes they were direct quotes, lines that Carlin himself had once spoken on stage, though Rebecca insisted she had never listened to his routines. Other times they were unfinished sentences, punchlines without setups, scrawled over and over as if the act of writing them might complete the thought. Daniel wanted to throw them away, but each time he tried, Rebecca grew frantic, clutching them to her chest, insisting they were the only way to understand what the house wanted. The most unsettling change came slowly, almost imperceptibly: the laughter. At first it was occasional, a single chuckle from an empty room. But over time it became more frequent, more layered, as though the house were filling with an unseen audience. The laughter was never cruel, never mocking. It had the warmth of genuine amusement, but that only made it more disturbing. It rolled through the halls at odd hours, spilling faintly through vents, vibrating in the floorboards, sometimes rising so subtly that they couldn't tell if it was coming from inside the walls or inside their own heads. One night, as Rebecca stood at the sink, the laughter rose behind her, clear and unmistakable, filling the kitchen like a crowd responding to a well-timed joke. She froze, hands trembling in the dishwater, unable to turn around. Daniel rushed in from the hallway, pale and wide-eyed because he had heard it too, from the other end of the house. From that night on, The house no longer felt like it contained the echo of one man's presence. It felt like a stage, and they were no longer the owners of it, but the audience being forced to stay for a show that never ended. The house wore them down slowly, but the breaking point came on a night thick with summer heat. The air felt unusually heavy, pressing against the walls, and every sound seemed amplified: the creak of the floorboards, the faint buzz of the power lines outside, the uneven hum of the refrigerator. Rebecca couldn't sleep. She sat upright in bed, her notebooks spread across her lap, tracing her finger over the half-finished sentences she had scrawled for weeks. Daniel stirred beside her, restless. He muttered in his sleep, words tumbling out as though he were reciting lines. Rebecca leaned closer, her skin prickling when she realized the words weren't his own. They were Carlin's sharp, familiar, unmistakable phrases she had read in old transcripts, lines she'd heard neighbors recall. Daniel's lips moved, his voice strained, until suddenly his eyes opened wide, staring at the ceiling as if he were caught mid-performance. He gasped, then sat up, his chest heaving. "What did I say?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Rebecca didn't answer. She only pointed at the notebook, her face pale, her eyes wet with fear. The words he had spoken were already written there, in her own hand. That night they decided to leave. They didn't pack much, just clothes, their phones, and a few personal items. Rebecca insisted on leaving her notebooks behind, almost as if they belonged to the house rather than her. They carried their bags down the stairs in silence, avoiding the study, avoiding the kitchen, avoiding any room that might call them back. But as they reached the front door, the house resisted. The lights flickered violently, one after another, creating a strobe that made the walls pulse like a living thing. The television clicked on in the living room, blaring static before cutting sharply into a black-and-white recording of Carlin's old routine. The sound filled the house, louder than it should have been, the cadence familiar, the jokes sharp and relentless. And then, mid-punchline, the recording warped. The voice lowered, distorted, but the laughter was real, live, filling the air around them. Rebecca dropped her bag and clutched Daniel's arm. From the study came the sound of a chair scraping back across hardwood, a pen scratching furiously on paper. Then silence followed by the creak of the doorknob turning, slowly, deliberately, though they had left it closed. Daniel threw open the front door, pulling Rebecca out with him. The night air hit them like a wave, cool and grounding. But even outside the house the sound followed them, the faintest trace of laughter, carried out through the windows and into the dark street. They didn't return. The next morning, a moving company arrived to collect their things, though much of it was left behind. The house went back on the market soon after, listed quietly, its history downplayed, the word unique emphasized in the brochure. Neighbors say no one has stayed there long since. Buyers come, intrigued by the history, but the house never seems to hold them. The lights still flicker, the television still chooses its own shows, and late at night, laughter still drifts down from the balcony, low, steady, and endless, as if the show goes on whether anyone is there to watch or not. And in the study, the desk remains. Realtors mention that the chair always sits slightly pulled back, as if waiting. The surface of the desk, no matter how many times it is polished, carries faint scratches, lines carved into the wood, restless, unfinished, like the setup of a joke that has yet to find its punchline. The house isn't haunted in the way people expect. It doesn't want to scare. It wants to perform. And those who live there soon realize the same truth Daniel and Rebecca did. George Carlin never really left. The stage just changed its shape. Even after Daniel and Rebecca fled, the house never slipped quietly back into its shell. Neighbors began to notice that its windows no longer reflected the world outside quite right. On certain evenings, if you stood across the street, you could see more than your own reflection in the glass. You could see the faint outline of a man standing near the balcony railing, cigarette in hand, head tilted like he was listening to something only he could hear. The outline was never still. It shifted, paced, gestured, as though caught in perpetual rehearsal. The realtor who handled the new listing refused to visit the house alone. She admitted later, off the record, that whenever she stepped inside to show prospective buyers around, Her voice would echo oddly as if the rooms themselves repeated her words a half-second later, twisting the tone into something mocking, amused. More than once, clients walked out abruptly, mumbling that the place felt too alive. The house itself resisted erasure. Contractors painted over the study again, sealed the floorboards, even replaced the windows, but the disturbances returned. One crew reported hearing laughter during their lunch break, though the house was empty except for them. Another swore that the old wiring in the walls hummed in syncopated rhythm, like a beat timed to the cadence of a monologue. They finished their work quickly, leaving tools behind just to avoid returning. Local rumor grew thicker. Some said they had walked their dogs past midnight and heard applause coming from within, faint but steady, like an audience responding to a performance that never ended. Others swore that if you parked your car at the bottom of the hill and rolled down the windows, you could catch fragments of sentences drifting on the breeze, not ghostly wails or screams, but sharp observations, the kind of wry commentary that once made George Carlin infamous. Rebecca never spoke publicly about the house again, but she confided once to a distant cousin that she sometimes woke in the middle of the night in their new apartment and swore she heard that same low chuckle in the corner. She wondered if leaving had been enough, or if the house had imprinted itself on her, carrying a part of her with it, or worse, sending a part of itself along with her. The house still stands, cloaked behind its hedges, listed and relisted, never empty long enough to fall silent, never occupied long enough for anyone to stay. And though its bricks and beams remain ordinary to the eye, those who step through its door all report the same subtle, unsettling truth. You're not just inside a house. You're inside a set. The walls are the curtains, the lights are the stage, and somewhere in the shadows the show goes on. Because some voices, once amplified, refuse to fade. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.